If you want a checklist of all the important things to look for when purchasing your new home, then this is the episode for you.
Heal Your Home with Jason Ratcliffe.
Welcome to this week's episode of Heal Your Home. Within this episode, I'm going to give you 5 easy to remember tips that you and your family can use as a checklist when you're going around your new home to make sure that there's nothing fishy going on and there's no red flags that need to be looked into before signing the contracts to exchange.
Heal Your Home with Jason Ratcliffe.
So let's get started. All of the 5 top tips I'm about to give you will add up to a checklist of very easy to remember points which will focus on the main sections of the property and potential issues that might be raised that you can then identify as a way of knowing roughly how much you're going to get yourself into. Now, obviously, you're still going to need professional experts involved if you do not know what you're doing. So this checklist is very much for when you're viewing a property and not a conclusive diagnosis of what's going on. So point 1 we're going to be looking through is follow your nose and your sight. Now, this sounds so easy and obvious, and you're probably thinking, well, yeah, obviously. But it's so common to actually doubt yourself when you actually probably know more than you think you do. So if you can smell musky smells, if there's discoloration to any of the walls, for example, low level, or around window and door openings, this can suggest that there may be a damp issue in that property. Fresh paint is a big tale. If they have, or the owners have freshly painted the property prior to you coming and inspecting and having a look, they might be covering something up. Not saying they are, but sometimes, or more often than not, if it's freshly painted, then there is often some concealment going on, which could well be damp. So really just make sure that you're using your own common sense to identify if there's any signs of damp ingress, or also if there's any signs of flooding, for example, for bathrooms. So if there's staining on the ceilings, again, you can clearly see the discoloration, and it can also leave quite a big trail around an area that may well be causing issues. So again, ask questions when you're there, figure out when it was painted, why it was redecorated, why certain cut repairs were undertaken, when they were done as well. Which leads me very much nicely onto point 2. So really scrutinize the structural integrity of the property. Now, it's very difficult for somebody who isn't experienced in the property industry to be able to identify serious cracks and movement and what's just aesthetic. But anything above and beyond a hairline crack is probably something that you really should be looking into. So a lot of the time, if there's cracking, what we call kind of hairline or shrinkage, so for example, between the inner face of a main wall and the ceiling, or staircases or around doors, internal partitioning walls, things like that, quite often they're caused by vibrations, so slamming of doors, for example, or the thermal differential. So if something gets heated up, so you put your heating on, for example, and all those components start expanding, they'll expand at different rates, which then causes such cracking. So they may look quite scary, or they may look quite serious, but quite often they may well just be aesthetic and will require some minor repairs. Now, this isn't the case for all cracking. Obviously, if you've got some solid walls or load-bearing walls inside your property and they end up having cracking, and if they've been repaired and you can see that they've been repaired and the cracks reopen, then there's signs potentially something else is going on. So this could be classed as a red flag. But also if there's stepped cracking or cracking in the main walls, so the outside envelope walls, or if there's any kind of movement or undulation or something that doesn't look quite right with your roof, for example, or if windows and doors are seized and then they're not quite opening correctly, this could be due to the pressure and movement of the main walls and the structure, which can then affect the actual window and door units themselves. So all of these things can be telltale signs that there is structural movement. But again, even if it is structural movement, It doesn't necessarily mean that there is going to be an issue that needs addressing or that's expensive. But it is important to make sure that you get the relevant expertise involved, so structural engineers at that point. So point 3 is very much assessing the age and the condition of key systems and key components of the property. So we're not just talking about modern builds, we're talking about renovations, we're talking about older buildings, mortgageability issues, and also asbestos obviously is a big one before 1999 when it was banned. So these are the types of things that you need to be asking questions. So when it was constructed originally, if any works were undertaken, have they been undertaken with building regulation approval, and if planning permission was needed as well, making sure that that's in place. And if there was any structural alterations, so there was openings, for example, of the living space and layout, it may look amazing, but just make sure that those things are in place and a structural engineer has been involved to actually identify whether or not those types of beams, for example, RSJs, etc., have been put in place and it is safe and is not going to move. That's also really important because if you get buildings insurance, it can become invalid if you try and claim on these types of things in the future. And it turns out that these types of tick box exercises and safety precautions have not been completed when the works were done. So point 4, now this one is a little bit detailed, so look behind the cosmetics of the property. Like I said originally, fresh paint, fresh decoration can be a very good telltale sign that something is going on behind the scenes, behind the surface. It may look amazing, they may have put brand new kitchens and bathrooms in place, lovely flooring, some really nice decorations, but actually that might be covering up structural deficiencies, dampness, issues with roof joists, all sorts of things that they may well be trying to mask. So it's really important to have a look within the areas such as eaves or getting the roof void if you can. Have a look around to make sure that there's nothing there that's untoward. If you, at this point, if you do have a contact such as a builder or a roofing specialist, it would be great to bring them along. If you ask nicely enough, or they have the time, or you know them personally, they may well do it for free anyway. So at least you have a second pair of eyes to be able to look over certain areas behind the cosmetic, lovely appearance that may well be there. And also get it in writing as well. So if you do bring somebody along and they do notice something, ask them if they wouldn't mind putting it in an email for you or a headed letter, because then this is something that can be brought to the vendor's attention or the estate agent or the surveyor. If you're having a surveyor then come in and undertake a further inspection, it helps give a clear, rounded picture of what's going on and what your concerns are. But also number 5, examine the exterior and drainage. Now, around the property, it's so important because surface flooding can be a really big issue. If the current owners have landscaped the gardens and they made them look lovely, quite often they then raise the external ground level, which can cause an increased risk of water ingress, but also drainage issues. If you have a sudden downpour and there's a tarmac area or concrete area, it may cause surface flooding, which can obviously cause its own issues. So it's really just having a look around for these things. If there's any pooling, if there's any muddy areas that don't seem to be dispersing anywhere. Boundaries is a big issue, which sometimes can get missed. So make sure that the boundaries look defined. It sounds obvious, but does the boundary match up with where you think the property's gardens and etc. should be? Is there any gates that are leading off to some random neighbour's garden? Or is there a garage which you can't quite gain access to via vehicle access because something's in the way? These are the types of things that if they don't look right, just ask the vendor. I've known properties personally where they've not known, they haven't checked their drainage for years and years, and all of a sudden it goes from not being an issue to a huge part of their property then starts moving almost overnight. And as well as that, the external of the property, again, common sense, it's really, really important. Has it got render? Is it painted? Is it exposed brick? Is it exposed stone? What does it look like? You don't need to understand the implications of the structure, what it the building pathology and the understanding behind it, but are there any obvious cracks? Are there any blown, blistered render? Is there anything sort of cracking or movement that's noticeable, particularly around windows and doors or below roofline level? These are the sorts of areas that you can flag up and notice quite easily without really having any expert opinion on the matter at that point. And again, you can then ask the vendor or the estate agent, well, actually, what's going on here? How long has that been like that? So those are your 5 top tips. They're the 5 that really, really stick out, and to me personally are really important. So hopefully that helps.
And now, a listener question for Heal Your Home.
So our listener question for this week's episode of Heal Your Home is by Lucy from Reading. This is great. I used to live next to Reading. I've got a great connection there. So this is lovely to have listeners coming in from that area. Now, she has had an awful experience based on her estate agent trying to pressure her into purchasing the property without having any professional inspections, which unfortunately you're not alone. There are some really good ones, but there are estate agents that do try and pressure buyers into completing, because back to your question, how do you go about stopping this from becoming an issue? You need to be wary of timescales. If there are specific timescales in place, whether the vendor needs to actually move quickly, for example, this all needs to be confirmed way before you go down the route of investing any time or money. So at the time of offering, I would basically be identifying if there are any time restrictions and why, and then manage your inspections and investigations within that time period. If you do not think it's manageable and you do not feel comfortable, even if it is or you think maybe your dream home, it might not be the best buy for you, because it is very much gambling with your home, your future, and your future generations, I suppose, in some circumstances. So it's really important to make sure that you get all your ducks in a row. And when you go into that property for the first time, take as many photos as you can of anything that you think may be an issue, even if it's not on the list of this episode. And also take notes, take a notepad with you. So that's the initial advice I would give. And then after that, absolutely get a survey. You are well within your right to do that. So I hope that helps. And again, thank you so much for listening.
Jason's Tenant top tip.
So the top tip for this episode is know when to walk away. This is so important. Now, investment opportunities, if you're an investor looking into investing in a property to rent or to flip, it's much easier to do. But if you are absolutely in love and you have found your new forever home, it's very difficult to be able to identify the practical actions or separate them from your emotions. And a lot of the time, the things that can cause the biggest heartache and also financial stress is very much around putting your heart over your head and purchasing something and say, I will work it out. But actually, if something doesn't feel right, really look at it from a practical perspective, write down the pros and cons of that property purchase to make sure that you are comfortable and fully understand what you are committing to, because it is definitely one of life's biggest financial purchases. So make sure you do the right thing. And I hope that helps.
Heal Your Home with Jason Ratcliffe.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Heal Your Home. Why not check out a full array of our services at jason-ratcliffe.co.uk. Here you will also be able to find top tips and guides which are free to download. You can submit listener questions through our website or email us at hello@jason-ratcliffe.co.uk, and we'll do our absolute best to get you on our show under listener questions. Don't forget, you can subscribe anywhere you listen to your podcasts and YouTube if you're watching along. It really does mean a lot, and your support is greatly appreciated. So thank you very much. Your health, your future, it all starts here.